Could you tell us about what a particular reality is?
So a particular reality was devised by Joe and Michelle, and I believe that they were having many previous conversations before the collective sort of came about students of colour feeling isolated in respect of their cultural identity and lived experience, and I think also maybe their experiences in navigating higher education, especially arts education. And I remember getting an email when I was in first year, and Joe had done a call out, and it was like, oh, a particular reality. If you're feeling, isolated, if you're feeling slightly anxious or scared, or not really sure like where you fit in the fine art course or just in university in general, we're looking to do a session at Raven Row with Goldsmith students.
And Tara, did you find it in a similar way?
So I think at the time I was in my final year, I think. So Michelle was my tutor, and a lot of my work at the time, and still actually at the moment, responded to heritage and discussions of colonialism and things that perhaps, or subjects that perhaps I weren't being nurtured in the space that I was in. I think for me, it was about kind of developing and creating a space for students and staff to, as Amrit said, feel comfortable in a conversation and kind of just sort of say, I don't really feel like this sort of conversation is being taken seriously, or I'm feeling isolated, or I'm feeling frustrated that I can't talk about certain things in my work that without, having some pre-perception drawn or something.
And so Joe and Michelle, how did that connection come about? Because the invitation to the students came from the two of you.
Before a particular reality, Michelle, the show that I put together and really wanted you to be in, because I knew a lot about your relationship between teaching and practice. Mm-hmm. And it had chimed with me and my own sense of that relationship. And then you came and made some work in this show at Tintype Gallery, and all of your students came. And there was just this lovely moment of one day being in the gallery with a load of Kingston students as part of Harold Duffy's work, and then another day being in the gallery with loads of your students from Goldsmiths, and just had this kind of feeling of recognition. And so when my own concerns around the experiences of my students that I was working with at Kingston, when I started to really feel they were becoming urgent, it was Harold and Michelle that I kind of recognised as people who could enter into a conversation with me. And that's all it began as, wasn't it, Michelle, I think?
That's correct. And I think it turned out that the things that you were concerned about with your students, there were questions really around POC students feeling really atomised on the course, and there were certain comments made that destabilised their sense of belonging on the course. And similarly, at Goldsmiths, whilst you might think that we had a kind of like strong and diverse cohort, we didn't seem to really have the capacity to talk about it, and we might talk about it one-on-one in a tutorial, but I think that was also a specificity of being a tutor of colour. And I think that when speaking to my students of colour, they often said things to me, personal experiences of how teaching on the course was going, or their inability to connect with others. And I was really concerned. So I think that when Joe reached out, I ran with it, because I was like, actually, we've got a similar problem here, and I'm not entirely sure what we can do about it. And I often think collaboration in moments like that, that's the moment to kind of get more brains in the room. So that's, I think, how it began.
So a particular realities was a way of finding a method of working, was it? Is that right to say? From what you've all said, that you didn't really know what you were getting into. You didn't really know what it entailed, or what it would be, or how it would come about, or even really where it would start. And I wanted to ask you as well about the name, A Particular Reality. I wanted to hear where this came from, and how you came to decide on that name for the project.
I think I should just give a little bit of context that I was working with two other artists from 2016, Rahana Zaman, who still teaches at Goldsmith, and Samia Malek, as part of Women of Colour Index reading group. And we'd come across a number of texts in the archives, and one of them happened to be of a South African artist called Gavin Yanchus, who, in a talk that he delivered at East Midlands Art Conference in 1986, it was called Art and Cultural Reciprocity. I just was very struck by what he said. I'd like to read it to you just so that I don't mangle his words. He said, a black visual art is an innovative expression of a particular reality, a reality set in the framework of specific cultural and historic forces. These are cultural domination by Western Eurocentrism and marginality to it, the experience of exploitation, appropriation, slavery, inequality and racism, and the long and abominable history of colonialism. A black art emerges from this framework and is vitalized by these forces. And this was a text that I found whilst doing the WOCI reading groups, and it stuck with me because I appreciated just how to the point it was, in a way that, you know, we should speak very openly about the abomination of colonialism. We should speak about the kind of Western-centric location in our references and in how we situate our teaching. And I think that what was also hopeful in that bit of text was this idea of a black art emerging from something so violent, actually. And it's not to say that the work of artists of colour has to only speak to those histories, but just that there was something vital in Gavin's words, and that really what I think we wanted for the project was that we could look at the specificities of the conditions of making and the problems that we encounter, but that we could also move on from that, so that it wasn't only about pain. And I mean, what's interesting about Gavin is he's still practicing today. I'd like actually to contact him for another iteration of this project. We were in a group show last summer, so I can get his details. But in 1986, he was a senior lecturer at Chelsea School of Art. And I just would really love, I'm doing another research project at the moment. I'd love to know what the teaching landscape was like in 86. And what strikes me from that text of Gavin's is we're still dealing with some of those problems. And so, you know, that's a problem in itself. But ultimately, I sort of brought, I hope that the group felt comfortable with that name, but I kind of brought it along because I was very moved by his words.
Yeah, obviously that phrase, you know, kind of really hit a nerve when it kind of landed in Amrit's email box and maybe Tara's email box. And I'm just thinking about, Amrit, that you mentioned that you met, you know, you went along to this first meeting at Raven Row, and Tara, I'm guessing you were at the first meeting as well. So it'd be really nice to hear what happened in that meeting and what it felt like, and some of the kind of issues and some of the things that came up, and just to kind of share it with everyone what it was like to be at that first meeting.
I think I was really happy to see such a big group of people together. We were all from different year groups, different kind of friendship groups, and perhaps we may not have crossed paths, but for that moment we were all there together discussing something that was universally in the back of our minds, or perhaps too much in the forefront of our minds. I feel like when it's something that you're feeling quite personally, you get quite wrapped up in how it makes you feel or how you're reacting to it. So I think it can be quite healthy to kind of reflect on those feelings with other people as well, in a space that didn't require you to be anything but kind of honest about how you're navigating that context.
I think similarly to Tara, I remember walking into the Raven Row space and just being so like pleased that there was loads of other people that felt something from that original call out and were sort of had that willingness to really be open and brutally honest about, you know, those lived experiences. And I think in a way it was really cathartic. And I remember in one part of the session we got paired with another person from the other institutions. We then got to have a bit more of a specific conversation about our art practices and where our interests lie, and say if we were to use a traditional cultural material in the work and the issues surrounding that, and that process of just talking and having conversations with other people felt incredibly cathartic, and almost like a burden had been like lifted, knowing that you weren't alone. And you know, I think it was just really enriching just to be really honest with one another. And it was also kind of nice because we sort of made friendships as well. Although, you know, we were exploring, you know, hard hitting stuff, there were moments of like, you know, real sort of celebration. And I think that was quite exciting.
And there was a point when the group made a decision to bring stuff together and make a video. Was that the Fake Woke video? And that was shown, wasn't it, in the Dean's space at Kingston. And I think that's when I saw a lot of the stuff that you'd been talking about and experienced it. So I just wondered, you know, how did that come about, and what was the, you know, did it feel really important that there was some kind of outcome or some kind of connection to a wider audience?
Michelle, you might have to correct me if I've misremembered this, but I think we'd had quite a strong sense when we'd first met that we wanted it to be kind of creatively productive for our students. You know, we wanted it to give them something beyond a conversation that would enable them to have opportunities for showing and for disseminating work. Although we might have had clear objectives about where our thinking was coming from, which was the experience of our students, we didn't have very many objectives about where we were going. But that was one, I would say, that was quite key.
Just picking up from what Amrit said, we actually very much was grateful that at Raven Row we accessed this lovely studio at the top of the building, and we ended up sharing some food together, and that seemed more fitting really to just start to kind of make connections as friends, which is, you know, very hard to think about in our current situation with the ongoing pandemic. But it was such a special moment where people were actually being able to make plans beyond our group, really. So there was that friendship thing, and then the reason that Fake Woke situation developed was really to be able to kind of evidence some of those conversations. You know, we've got things like social media, we've got ways to connect, but it's incredible that some of those experiences, even as a student for my BA, I was really one of the very few POC students in between 1997 and 2001, and I literally didn't have the guts to connect with someone else who was in the year above me, who was South Asian and I thought looked really cool, and I wanted to say hello to them, but I just couldn't. You know, it was just one of those things, and I wish that I had that capacity, but I don't know what it takes to break the ice. You know, you're either in the same year or you're even in the same bay. Fake Woke was one of the kind of nicer outputs, but it was actually more about the potential for collaboration and friendship, I think, that really drove this project.
I really want to draw the conversation towards the zine, which we've got on the screen, which is another output from the project. You were saying how these issues are perpetually re-emerging, and that they have been doing that for a very long time, and that actually perhaps contemporary art is not so contemporary in practice. And the zine is this form that has been a protest artifact for a long time and still is being used in protest as a form of communication. And so I wonder, for this project, how you came to decide on using the zine as a way to speak.
I think following Fake Woke's situation, I think it was coming up to the end of that year, that academic year, and I think we left off not really sure where, APR was going to go, and it took us a really long time, I think, at Kingston for us to reconnect as a group again. And I believe we all met up right before the pandemic hit in the March. And I remember in that meeting that we spoke about, Joe, you'd received some funding. And I remember you said, there's so many different things that we can do with this funding. I think we were talking about even setting up some workshops that could bring a different aspect to this collaboration with Goldsmith. And then things kind of went a bit crazy as soon as, COVID, came in full force. I think they were saying it's best if the money was to use for like some sort of documentation of the project. And I think that's where the conversation about the zine sort of came about. And I think we just had a meeting just to discuss what that zine would look like and where that would go.
How did you come to make it? Did you start making work specifically for the zine? Did you commission other artists too to make work for the zine? How did it kind of form materially?
So it really kind of sprung out of the start of the new Zoom era, wasn't it? So we were kind of having little calls and conversations, and at first it was really just about talking about whose works we really liked from the Fake Woke video. So we kind of just as a group discussed what kind of things would best introduce the project, and so we kind of curated around that. And I think because we were so involved in the editing of the zine, for us it seemed really important that it wasn't our work that was being showcased. It was some of the other members who perhaps maybe they had other things going on and didn't feel as though they felt as though they needed some sort of time out from the project. And we wanted to really continue bringing them into the journey and the development of the project. So it was really important that some of those works were involved. And then obviously there were texts, and Joe and Michelle kindly wrote a really great piece of text at the start, and it kind of just developed from there. I think that towards the end, the design aspect of it almost snowballed really quickly, because we kind of had concentrated so much on context and actual content of the zine, and then towards the end of when we wanted to distribute it, it was all about design, and we were just really kind of trying to hammer that home. So yeah,
it's really good design as well, by the way.
Such a lovely design.
And also we should mention that I really enjoyed how it just, looking back, how there was a kind of shift from being, part of APR and then becoming commissioning editors, and also the fact that the zine also includes the writing of Raju Rage, who contributes a beautiful text at the end called A Recipe for Resistance, and Roots. And it's just one of those, I just think that the work starts to do what we were hoping, which was to kind of not really think about the idea of a hierarchized idea of these are students and they're participating in a workshop, but just to think about the works as artworks in their own right, and that they sit alongside more established artists, and through Raju's writing, and just that should be what we want of all our students across degree courses, that they're artists at a younger stage in their careers, but they are making really strong work that should be seen. So I think that the fact that it's designed well actually helps to engage in the zine more. I mean, that sounds a bit superficial, but I think that it really is important, that this is something that people would want to dip into, because I think that, yeah, my hope is that this is something that is a really invaluable resource. I think Raju, after receiving a copy, sort of said, can I share this? I've got to send this to lots of people, and they were part of working on some incredible learning resources in the past. So it's just that's what we should be doing with this sort of work, I think.
So while you were making the fake woke video and the zine itself, did you come across like any issues that you maybe weren't aware of before, or did you come across like issues that you didn't quite like conceptualize or articulate?
The biggest sort of unknown to me or unforeseen to me, which I suspect was much more familiar to lots of the members of the group, was how our kind of energies for it could be up and then could be really depleted. And I think Amrit, we laugh about it now, but we had a meeting with just a few of us at Kingston where one of our group talked about fatigue, just intense fatigue and a real difficulty in rising to even the project. It's not something that was unexpected to me, but to sort of witness it, to witness what it can be like to live with an energy that can drive something, but that can also kind of really, really deplete you. That felt really important to learn. And another thing was about our differences between our two institutions, because I think Michelle and I knew that at such a intuitive level, that part of the reason that this was an important connection, dialogue, was because of our differences, our locales. Kingston is in the suburbs, it's in a predominantly white part of London. Goldsmiths is almost the direct opposite to that. It's much more highly populated, it's urban, it's much more ethnically diverse. And I think Michelle and I had an intuition for why those two states were important to connect. But I think they became much more realised through the project. At one point, some of the Kingston students suddenly got a bit kind of scared of the possibility of activism because the protests at the town hall were really alive and kicking at Goldsmiths, and whilst there was much kind of alliance over the cause, somehow there was a little bit of kind of concern over whether a different voice was just as valid. And actually what I think we've learned is that, or a different method, I think actually what we've learned is that all of the methods are valid parts of a kind of spectrum of activism, or a spectral kind of approach.
I wonder, then, sort of continuing from that, just to think, just wanted to ask Amrit really about what you feel about the contemporary art arena as a place for holding this urgent conversation.
Yeah, I remember we had this conversation about, with art especially, that can be the forefront of political change, but sometimes that doesn't always work out and that doesn't always pan out. And I think it was a really big question of like, well, how do we accommodate those parts, or those people that don't feel comfortable in being loud and being extremely visible within that change or protest. And I remember we sort of came up with this APR as this sort of bubble, and it sort of molds and it moves and it's always moving all the time, and people can go in and people can come out again. And I remember that was quite a big thing of us thinking about how this project will go further in the future. And I just always think about that shape, that wiggly shape, and how APR is sort of like that. It's like moving and it's molding all the time.
I've realised there's another thing we've discovered. It feels that it is microcosmic, that it represents things that, you know, Andrea, you asked the question about contemporary art, and actually it feels as though in the project is the kind of DNA for the findings that simply are everywhere. So it feels that it kind of gives a way of looking at issues that are being played out in all kinds of institutions. And sorry, and just one other thing that Amrit mentioned about wanting to offer something more broadly. That was something in that first group of 3 meetings. And I remember Mona was very key in this, but that everyone in the group was kind of strikingly unanimous about wanting to have legacy that prevented future students from recovering exactly the same ground. So not expecting to be able to change things in an instant, but certainly wanting to have some level of improvement for the next person. And that sense of legacy, or kind of hand me down, felt really important. That feels quite central to the project.
That's a really important point to bring up, Jo, because actually for artists of colour, there's such a very real possibility of erasure and invisibility. And I think that legacy, there's one problem in that you can make things, but they could end up being pushed into an archive. So there's this, and I think that the archive is a very important space, but you could also say that, you know, once it's made, it just gets kind of deposited. What's exciting about what's currently happening with APR is I hope that it continuously has to reinvent itself, not only through the fact that there will be new collaborators through different students that pick the project up, but because the form may have to adapt for the times or the budget. So, you know, the fact that the zine happened was probably the best option we could have in a time where we were actually atomized back in our homes due to the pandemic, and we could still speak through that platform and still showcase the work. I think that APR will adapt depending on who chooses to take its call, and, you know, even its name may kind of adapt. Like Jo and I were thinking that it's not just a particular reality in the singular, but particular realities, plural. You know, there's something plural in this project, and I think we should just be as flexible as we can around that so that it stays relevant. In fact, it will always stay relevant, because I don't think this is an issue that goes away. But I do really love that it's true, Jo, that so many of the original participants did not want the work to be another moment where we had a kind of sticking plaster approach, and it kind of made it better for a short while, and then we the money ran out, or, you know. So I think there's a commitment now from both Kingston and Goldsmiths to keep funding this project, which is extremely exciting, because it just means we can do something more, you know, and that it doesn't become that temporary fix.
I wanted to ask you all as well about that encounter with the work, because I imagine actually that the zine has a much further reach than an exhibition perhaps would. Wondering then, where does that encounter occur, and who is it for?
I think for me, I was, again, I think an element of that, of the answer, we didn't know. Well, I certainly didn't, but that we were open to it reaching whoever it needed to reach, whoever needed to see it. And I think realistically, it started off, you know, as something that was seen by Kingston and Goldsmiths BA students, but then it's expanded into, you know, across year groups, across courses. But then we've also, as Michelle said, Raju was excited about it and wanted to distribute it further. So, and I think you're really right in saying that just naturally, you know, because of the ease of being able to distribute a digital publication, they, you know, the possibilities of who's going to see it is just suddenly, you know, times 100 or more. And so I think for me personally, I think it was right that we made a publication. It felt right, because we kind of later were hoping that it would be something that gets distributed further to other art colleges around the country.
And of course, Amrit, you're organising this panel talk where you're going to ask other artists to respond to that encounter as a panel event. And so maybe you could speak a little bit about that and who you've picked and maybe why you've chosen those artists.
Yeah, so I think the first speaker I decided to choose was Adesola Akinle, I believe. And she is a dancer, choreographer and teacher. And I think she's a senior lecturer at Middlesex University. And I was quite surprised actually, because she in the list that I was reading, apparently she had led a roundtable discussion on institutional racism in classrooms. And I thought that was really poignant, and I thought that would feed quite well into, you know, what maybe the future of APR wants to, you know, delve into down the line. But I felt like that was quite an important person to be included in this panel discussion. And I thought, you know, it'd be nice to have someone from a dance field that's, okay, then they're not specifically from a fine art field, but I also feel like, you know, people from other creative sectors can just bring a new perspective and, you know, and bring new ideas that perhaps you hadn't considered before. And then I think after that, I chose Larry Achiampong, who is an artist and also was a lecturer at RCA. So it was quite a nice, you know, having an artistic voice as well, but also an educator's voice as well. And I think they explore ideas surrounding class and cross-cultural and post-digital identity, which was just another layer. I kind of wanted to have all these different voices. And I think sometimes when you have different people coming in, I think that sort of allows for a more intersectional approach or discussion. And then I chose finally a Professor of Education and Social Justice, Kawant Bhopal, who I believe teaches at Birmingham University. And I think a few years ago, she published a book called White Privilege, The Myth of a Post-Racial Society. And once again, I thought it'd be nice to have her perspective, because she is an educator. She's working and researching all these themes that are, you know, really incredibly important. And I think, you know, reiterating what I said before, I think sometimes it's really good to get these different perspectives to bring a new sort of idea or a new sort of approach on these themes. And hopefully I'll hear back from all of them, fingers crossed.
I do have a question particularly for Joe. So I wanted to ask you, as a white woman, but also as one of the key members in this project, what made you realize the urgency of like this work, but also that there was an indifference or fake wokeness that's within like art institutions, but like just generally in institutions all over or organizations?
I have to sort of slightly cast my mind back to almost a different perspective to be able to answer that, because I think once you have become aware of those inequalities and indifferences, it's hard to imagine that you ever found them new. If you see what I mean, it's hard to imagine that you ever were in a place where you didn't see them and therefore they became visible. Seeing racism as a systemic, also an individual, but a systemic problem meant that in a way it couldn't not be there. And that therefore, and this is not even directed specifically at Kingston, but for all institutions of which I am part, there is a complacency around, and it's been a worse complacency to my knowledge and understanding since the time when Gavin Yunch wrote that text, because it was thought to have been understood and dealt with from the perspective of white people. And I was quite young then, but I grew up in a world where I thought this was something that had been addressed. And what my gradual kind of awakening has revealed to me is that not only is that not the case, but possibly it's worse because it's been institutionalized. So in a sense, I couldn't not see that after being educated to see it, if that makes sense. That's been absolutely kind of pivotal for my own career, because now I understand that it's my responsibility as part of the institution. And I've changed my voice in relation to the institution. I'm fiercely loyal to my institution because I believe by being loyal to it, I can invest in it and better it. So I hope that when I criticise it, I'm criticising myself, and therefore I'm invested in improving it. And that's why I decided to apply for the head of department role, because there are not enough people in the institution or even outside of the institution who have been given the career opportunities to ensure that it would be someone who could make a difference. And it's a big responsibility, but I think that's the one that I choose to take.
I think there's a question really. I wondered, Ria, you'd be particularly interested in this question, and maybe it is kind of also to you as well. But it's like, yeah, so Amrit and Tara, what has it been like? How important is it for you to be working with artists and educators like Joe and Michelle, with their positions, in institutions? How does that impact your experience as a student to kind of be working with these artists and educators in this way? And I'm thinking, Amrit and Tara, you've got a longer experience of this, but maybe Ria as well. How does it feel for you coming in new as a first year and this work being done?
Do you want me to go first, or?
I don't mind.
Okay. I think for me, at the beginning of the course, when we first started going into our own individual practices, I was obviously I've said it before, but I'm working on the British Raj and the colonialism that the British brought to India. I was really worried about overstepping a certain line and offending anyone who didn't quite understand that history aspect of it. And I think the whole particular reality project as a whole sort of creates a bit of a welcoming of those historic facts to just be spoken about as well. It sort of gives me that sort of peace of mind of, okay, maybe I'm not going to overstep it. Because as a first year, I don't exactly want to get on anyone's wrong side or anything. So yeah, I think that's my like side of it.
Yeah, for me, I guess my involvement in APR has immensely impacted my experience as a student. I think it's been really eye-opening for me, and not only as a student, but also it's been very eye-opening in the world of education and what it's like to be an educator and what that role looks like. And I guess sort of, you know, those very harsh realities in being, you know, an educator, being a tutor, being a lecturer. And I think just APR as a whole has just given me, I guess, this sort of space of imagination to sort of learn, just wanting to learn and unlearn and, you know, do better, and sort of having that space to create sort of radical change and wanting to sort of that change and that momentum to sort of continue into the future.
I think, yeah, just following on from that, and also picking up on what Michelle said earlier, that there was a real desire and need to create kind of a level playing field, a kind of more horizontal way of working rather than a hierarchical one. And so, you know, being able to share and exchange with your tutor or with other tutors on the course, or even, you know, at Kingston or a different institution completely, just, you know, reiterated that you know, we're all artists, we're all makers, we're all adults who are interested in researching and thinking and sharing these ideas. And I think for me especially, you know, I've been out of the institution 2 years now, and I think it gives you more hope that it's something that can be continued outside of education. And you know, at the moment now I'm working on other cultural programs and coordinating programs, and you know, you go, inevitably you do go back and you work with educators, and you realize the well, I kind of knew, but it really does highlight to you the importance of intergenerational working, because it almost kind of makes it into kind of a mentorship, but also a friendship, and it kind of really highlights that you know, that exchange can be both ways. You know, you can offer a tutor help or insight into something that perhaps is useful to them, and vice versa. So it doesn't always have to be a one-way thing, because it is a reality that that's just how interactions kind of seem to work best. So
maybe just before we end, I wanted to speak to something that you said, Joe, about that you recognized a level of privilege that you had that was not what all of your colleagues and students had felt, and that it was a choice to be able to do this work, and that is also what a lot of your colleagues in the institution or in arts organisations don't choose to do. And when you were speaking saying that, I was thinking about my own experience, and quite often also you and Amrit were talking about fatigue earlier. And when that sense of fatigue hits, I feel an overwhelming sense of urgency for this work to be done. But also, I absolutely hate the fact that I have to do it, and it doesn't feel like a choice. And I just wanted to go back to that point, really, that there is a recognition from you as both as an ally and a participant of this work, that it is a choice, and a choice that that you have made space for this to happen. So that I just wanted to repeat that again, and think about, I suppose, that in relation to the many times that I've encountered a resistance to people choosing to do that.
Yeah, is it all right if I just come back to that? Because I think it's quite important for me to speak back to that in relation to other white colleagues. And just, I think, and I'm, by no means the only one. There are other, and Andrea, there are plenty of people who are ready to make that choice or have made that choice. But I think there is, and I don't excuse this, I just kind of observe it, that there is a tremendous amount of fear around making the choice. But once the choice is made, it's not one that one goes back on. As a white person, you really face up to and reconcile yourself with your white privilege, is when you can lay aside the fear and begin to move on from it into something that's much less narcissistic and much more productive.
What's really important, as someone who has been teaching in higher education since 2014 to this capacity, I feel that the issue is that so much of the work, the exhaustion you speak of, JJ, has been, necessarily put on our shoulders as the individuals that might be able to have some kind of solution to this, and unfortunately, I just think it does take this kind of mutual effort. It takes a kind of porous give and take between us all, and I do think that it takes a level of that the fear is there, and I think, but there's more defense than fear for some, defensiveness, because the work of anti-racism is really quite brutal if you get down to it, and nobody wants to really put it. I'll give you an example at the minute, which is really quite telling. We're trying to really respond to questions around structural racism within our department and the college as a whole, but we've got so many things that we're trying to speak to and deal with, necessary and urgent things. For example, thinking about our neurodiverse students, something that we've really lacked attention to, and yet, just as a very small example, it's more easy for staff at the minute to sign up to support neurodiverse students and staff than it is for them to sign up and currently talk about the ongoing pressing issues of structural racism and the work of anti-racism in our department. And while I don't wish to pit this against one another, far from it, it's just really interesting. Interesting is probably not the right word, that it's not easy for people to say, do you know what, today I'm going to actually consider my part in this equation.